bless our speaker. We bless our intent in opening up our Earth Ministry team to new members, new ideas, and much growth. We ask this in Jesus' name. And so it is. So, the agenda for today is to have a short highlights, greatest hits of our last year, and what we're doing the next couple of months as we round out our action agenda. And then we'll hear our speaker and hopefully learn more about what we can do to be more active participants in Earth Ministry, which is kind of our sister organization. I'll share those remarks after I tell you what we have been doing. In this incarnation of Earth Ministry, the year got off to a really good start when Mary Lou Dickerson, who is the standing core team member here, who does have she's an elected politician. Former elected politician, yes. Has experience in politics, and that's been very helpful. And she's really good at motivating people. So around our Earth Care Day planning, she suggested that we poll the entire congregation on what are their priorities. And the top priority was clean water, and the second one was carbon issues and that sort of thing. And so she launched a partnership with Puget Sound Keepers and held an event late spring with that group, which cleans up the waters all around Puget Sound, and it was a wonderful family beach cleanup at Golden Gardens Park. It was really well attended, and it's forging this partnership with them, and we'll be mentioning in a moment what the plan is to continue that activity. Then her partner, John Murnell, also initiated a Bigfoot project here in the church basement and launched the whole regional Bigfoot campaign, which was a household carbon use or energy use awareness program, to be too short about it. But if you have any further questions about that, I'm sure John will be happy to give you the success report of that effort. Anyways, we have two real powerhouses on the core team, and another of our members, Jennifer Pelican, had to leave for another appointment. She lives on Vashon, but her claim to fame in our core group is that she bicycles from Vashon Island to church, and so she is the walk the talk person in our group, one of them, and it sets a really good example for the rest of us. So the issues that we did set up for our congregation, other than clean water and carbon awareness initiatives, were to continue to give input to our transition team on the disposition of materials as this church is demolished, to create space for another even better and more wonderful incarnation of Seattle Unity. So, reuse, recycle, and so on will be the hallmark of our individual input to Terry Loving as she heads up the team of teams. Ours is going to be crucial. I'm sure we all personally have some awareness of agencies that are responsibly disposing of materials or selling or auctioning. Our team is also involved in thinking about how to deal with transplanting some of the plant material from the building site, whether that be it adopted, be it moved over to the park. Those kind of ideas are still being explored because many of these plant materials were donated, and when the church was founded, so they should not be, in our opinion, destroyed during this exciting process. We're also working on continuing to work on issues of carpooling, van pooling, ride sharing, that sort of thing. And this will be especially important as we meet temporarily for however long down at the temporary church location. So that's still top of mind, and we're trying to figure out how to get that on the website. And James Tierney has volunteered his programming expertise to help us get that up and running. to us all the time is to focus on healthy living in general, and awareness of our impact of the environment. So, two to three people have suggested that in the month of December we kick off our meeting of that month on the topic of healthy holidays, and that would be a short meeting with maybe 10-15-minute presentations by experts such as Yolanda has offered to talk about eating healthy, during all the opportunities we have to overindulge during holidays. And Jeffrey Myers is a volunteer to talk about fitness and rest and awareness of all those kinds of things. And so if any others have any ideas on packaging, reducing your packaging, or doing other kinds of gifting and exchanges of those things, and want to share your tips and expertise on that, that would be the time to do it. So that would be the topics of our December meeting. But without further delay, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Lita Carson from Earth Ministry, and I'll briefly tell you how I learned about Earth Ministry. Was in the previous incarnation of this group, Earth Care Green Team. The two of our very motivated co-chairs, Jan Campbell and her partner, were Joan Gregory, were adamant that we join Earth Ministry as well as the National Unity Earth Care Ministry group. Earth Ministry is basically a regional organization that's interfaith, interdenominational. They're how many years old? 30. And it's been very active, greening congregations. They have a whole program about that. We have not been as active as we should. Lita's our first speaker from that organization, so she'll give us more background than I'm able to provide today. But we have been on the books as a member of theirs since then, but really have not taken advantage of all the teaching tools that they have. I put some of their materials on the back table. They published a lovely magazine, the Earth newsletter, and they have also quite a big presence online, and they also have neighborhood blogs. A number of the Seattle spin-offs have their own online blogs with their meeting schedules, and they each have independent projects going on. There are church sites where they've done rooftop gardens in the churches. They've transformed all the landscaping, that sort of thing, so you can see a truly visualized, green congregation, how that all works. So there's lots of learning opportunities that we're just beginning to take care of. So I'm just thrilled to have Leah take some time off her campaign for the initiative 1631, and hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about how that's been to work at the grassroots level all over the state. But it is a regional organization, so she's seen parts of the country that many of us may not have, and talked to some other viewpoints other than the urban liberal viewpoint on this particular topic, and others I'm sure so will be most interesting. And there will be a question and answer session with refreshments outside in the lobbies, and so refreshments are allowed in here afterwards if you care to stay for that. But we won't wait too much longer, because I know she has to get back to the hard work of passing that initiative. So, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Late morning, early afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to start by handing around those sign-in sheets that you all can sign in, so I can send you a nice thank you note after this. So thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Lita Zachariason, and I'm the Climate Field Organizer at Earth Ministry, which right now means that I am working with faith communities across the state to pass Initiative 1631. So I figured I'd tell you a little bit about myself and how I got here, and then a little bit about Earth Ministry and sort of our work, and I'll tell you a little bit about 1631, and then I'm happy to answer whatever questions are on your mind about the initiative or about being more involved with Earth Ministry or whatever you're interested in. So I grew up in Pullman, Washington, on the other side of the state. My mom is a UCC pastor over there, and I came to Seattle by way of
program. And then I got to about April, and my year was supposed to end in July, and I started working on Initiative 1631. And I started seeing just the amazing dedication of faith communities across the state and their excitement about this initiative. And I started seeing the coalition behind the initiative and working with the people on the ground, and I was like, I can't stop working on this initiative. So I just bothered everybody until they gave me a job. And I have lucky enough to stay on through the election to work on passing Initiative 1631. So that's a little bit of my backstory. For a little bit about Earth Ministry, which I think does a very good job of sort of setting the stage for the work that I'm doing now. Earth Ministry started 25 to 30 years ago with the Valdez oil spill off the coast of Washington State. There was a group of folks from St. Mark's Cathedral, just up the hill in Capitol Hill, who went down to clean up oiled shoreboards after that oil spill, and they were just absolutely devastated at what they saw, and it was so tragic. And they watched these beautiful creatures dying, and they said, our faith must tell us something about this. How is it possible that our faith doesn't say anything about caring for creation? So they went back and they talked with their pastors, and they took a look at the Bible again, and it turns out that actually our faith has a lot to teach us about caring for creation. And that hadn't been always the value that was lifted up the most in a lot of Christian circles. So they really started getting together and meeting with other churches and talking about creation care as a value that was essential to our faith, as things like caring for the poor and housing the homeless. And so they really started this program of teaching and preaching about creation care. And then, they started to get more involved with churches, and they realized there were a lot of churches that were on board with this idea of this value of creation care, but they wanted to do something about it. And so they started getting more interest in figuring out how they, as church groups, could actually start kind of putting that value into action. And they started the Greening Congregations program, which Susan mentioned, which was really at its core a way to sort of bring those values in and start living those out in their church communities. And so that was a lot of setting intentions to do things like recycling and composting and preaching about creation care and talking about it in worship services and building community gardens and sort of all of those ways to really lighten our steps on the earth as a church community. But then about 12 years ago, the Earth Ministry Board got together again, and they were looking at this program, and they were looking at the world, and they were looking at the the growing crisis of climate change in the world, and they realized that if they really wanted to live out these values, it wasn't enough to just work on these individual church levels. They needed to do something bigger. And they recognized the power of church communities and faith communities to really make systemic change when we come together and work on something we're passionate about. So Earth Ministry started their advocacy program. And that really started as a way to bring together faith communities and lift up that faith voice in a way that was a little bit more organized for systemic change. So through that, we've worked a lot with the state legislature on passing things like the Toxic Free Kids and Families Act, which got toxic flame retardants out of kids' products. We've worked on individual sort of campaigns to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. Like there was an oil terminal in Vancouver that we worked on stopping, and there were 7 coal terminals across the state that we worked with a big coalition on stopping. And so that's really where we are now, is we're looking at how do we start from these values that we share about caring for creation and making the world a more just place, and how do we integrate those all the way up to the point of really taking action and speaking up for our shared health. So that's kind of where I am now, is that I get to work on Initiative 1631, which is really, I think, an embodiment of a lot of the ways that we've taken those values and we've really put them into action and put them and work together on them to pass something that is really important. So Initiative 1631 is on the ballots. Hopefully all of you have voted. If you have not, you have 2 more days. Please vote. It is the Clean Air, Clean Energy Initiative. So the very basics of Initiative 1631 is that it would put a fee on the largest carbon producers in the state, and then use that money to reinvest in clean air and clean energy, and also invest in the communities that are the most impacted by climate change. And I am so blessed to work on this initiative, and I think that in so many ways, you know, the faith community has really turned out for this initiative in ways that I haven't seen a lot. So just some examples of things that our churches are doing. We had churches and faith communities who gathered signatures when we were trying to get it on the ballot. We've had churches that have hosted speakers training so that people of faith can go out and really talk about why they support 1631. We have 5 churches in the Seattle area that are serving as pop-up offices for the campaign, which basically means they've given over a space in their church for the campaign to use for the last month of the election cycle. They've been running canvases and phone banks out of those churches every single day, which is so amazing to me. When the campaign asked me if I thought the churches would do that, I was like, I don't know, but it's been really beautiful. It's been really amazing to see churches step up in that way. And then, you know, we've been out canvassing, we've been phone banking. Folks have been talking to their congregations about 1631. And I think it's been really incredible to see because it's not something that all of these churches are comfortable with. So, you know, like, I think a lot of times, and you know, the title of my talk is Politics in the Pulpit, but I think a lot of times we're told and we see that politics and faith are 2 separate things. And I think one of the things that's really important to me is to talk about the way that those 2 things come together. And for me, it's because there are all of these issues like creation care that we are told are these political issues that we can't talk about in church because we're not supposed to talk about politics in church. And without even going into the theology about talking about politics in church, because I will let pastors do that, I think that, you know, these issues are really moral issues, and climate change is a moral issue for us. It's an issue of children are dying, our earth is dying. We know that the people who are most impacted by climate change are low-income people and communities of color. And we have a moral obligation to do something about that. And churches and faith communities, because we have that moral voice, are able to lift up that voice and talk about these, not just in political terms, but as moral issues, and really make an impact, which I think is incredible. So I'm going to pause there and ask you a few questions because I love answering questions and don't like just talking at people. So do you have questions about the initiative, about Earth Ministry that I can answer? Yeah.
Not that I want to give energy to the argument against 1631, but could you address the argument put forth by on the other side of 1631 so that we can gain, or so that I can gain clarity.
So I think that the first thing I always like to say when we're talking about the No campaign is that the number one most telling thing is you can look at who's funding the No campaign and who's funding the Yes campaign. We have this great law in our state that you have to say on the bottom of all of your campaign things who's funding. So if you look at the Yes ads, the folks who are funding it are people like the Nature Conservancy. The American Lung Association has endorsed. You know, faith communities, we have not been the biggest contributors, but we're, you know, there in spirit. And the folks who are opposing, if you look at those ads and you look at the bottom, the top 5 are Phillips 66, BP, US Oil, Chevron, and Endeavor Marathon, which is also known as Tesoro. They changed their name a lot to try to trick us, but we're paying attention. So, you know, I think that keeping in mind where those messages are coming from is the most important thing to keep in mind, and keeping in mind that all of these kind of tactics that the oil companies are using, at the end of the day, oil companies are putting now I think we're almost up to $40 million. They're spending about $2 million a day, so it's hard to keep track. But about $40 million they're pouring into this initiative to stop it because they know that this is going to impact their profits. And they know that this is going to give us ways to have clean energy and not be so reliant on the oil companies, which is a great thing for us and not so good for them. But to address some of the specific things, I know one of their big arguments is this argument about the exemptions and that certain industries are exempt from the initiative. I personally love this argument because their number one thing they talk about is this coal plant in Centralia that's exempt from the initiative, but the way the language of the initiative is written actually ensures that that coal plant will be shut down by 2025. And the reason that's true is because the same groups who worked on this initiative, like the Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, Earth Ministry, all of us also worked together with that coal company on a plan to shut down that coal plant. And that had have already been in place. And what they're actually doing now, we've just recently learned, is the community of Centralia has decided to take the money that the coal company is having to pay them as sort of a decommissioning fee and reinvest that in putting the largest solar farm in the state on the site of the former coal plant, which is so cool. And it's exactly what we want. And so we want to make sure that happens. And so we're letting that plan, which we all already worked on and we know is a great plan, run its course. And so that's why there's that very specific exemption. There's a couple other really targeted exemptions for industries that we know we're going to need in this clean energy future, like aluminum and concrete and steel. And we, one of the groups that we work with a lot on this initiative were labor communities, and the labor community was really concerned that for these very they're called trade-dependent, energy-intensive industries would just move out of state if they were subject to this fee. And so we wanted to make sure that they had the sort of incentive to stay in state because we know that we're going to need their products and we know that they're creating good jobs. And we know that they're using the same energy grid that we are. So if they stay in Washington as our energy gets cleaner, their energy will get cleaner rather than them just moving out of state and continuing to pollute at the level they are. But even with all of that, what the oil companies don't want you to know is that 80% of the carbon emitted in Washington state would still be subject to the fee. So, the people who wrote this initiative, like I said, are the folks who want to reduce pollution. We know the effects of pollution and we want to see it reduced. And this initiative, I think, is a really good way to do that. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
First, I'd like to commend you on what you're doing. I think that's great. But this is new for me. But I'm interested in a thread from the state to the federal government globally. What type of thread is existing with the work that you're doing to integrate with a global vision in order to keep us high on the echelon as far as looking at the big picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think, so I'll start specifically with 1631, because that's what I've been working on, but I'll address the question more globally as well. But with 1631, 1631, what I did not mention the most important part of it, but not the most important part, one of the important parts is that it's a fee on carbon and not a tax. And that means that the money that we raise from this fee has to go directly towards creating clean energy. And this would be the first sort of this approach of both putting a price on carbon and then also investing more money in clean energy. This is the first sort of thing of its kind that's ever been tried in the country and probably the world. And so people are really watching Washington State right now because there's a real sense that this model that we're trying to pass could be sort of the equitable climate policy that we need to really kick the energy revolution into the next gear. That's also why oil companies are spending $40 million to oppose it, because they're really scared that if this passes and then works, which we hope it will, other states will continue to do that. And we've seen with a lot of sort of political issues in the United States, when the federal government isn't representing our interests and isn't willing to do what's right, the states are the ones who are really taking the lead. So with things like gay marriage, it was the states, and it was states like Washington that really stepped up and were passing that to the point where the federal government had to recognize that it was something that they had to do something about. And so I think that we, as at the state level, we have a lot more interface with our elected officials. We have in Washington a pretty progressive state and a state with a lot of passion for our state. I think we really want to see the best for Washington, and so we really have the power to make these changes that hopefully will have ripple effects on the larger level. And I think in a more broad sense, I feel very privileged to do this work because I think that progressive faith communities have a lot to offer, and I think that because of a lot of factors, it's really been more conservative and more hateful faith voices that have been the loudest. And we haven't really found our voice as progressive faith communities. And I think that we have the ability to really make a lot of change, and really we know that we can raise this voice for making the world a better place. And working on things like this and working on finding our voices locally and working together can create sort of that justice globally
do you have a thread with them to communicate with them, to let them know what you're doing? In order to kind of get them involved?
Great question. So I think that, I always have to say, I'm not a policy expert, so I'm not the one writing the policy. But the folks that are, I think that there is that global connection because we want to see what's working in other places and what's possible, and think about how we can bring that into our country. Because you're right, we really do need to be a global community in order to address this problem.
Kelly, one of our congregants here, was just telling me this morning that the New York Times did a story on 1631, and that's very unusual for them to pick that localized the legislation to talk about. So the word is getting out, and this initiative is being launched nationwide. So. The New York Times endorsed, folks like, Bill Gates is obviously a local person, but he usually does not endorse initiatives. Van Jones came, which was really fun, and did a little spot about the initiative. I got to meet him, that was exciting. But yeah, there's a lot of national attention because we're doing something really cool, and it's very exciting to kind of be on the ground and be in the state that's making that happen.
I led the for against that.
Sure.
And the biggest argument against was what it was going to cost.
Right.
The consumer. And so what would you say?
No, that's a great question, and I think that, that was a really big concern when we were writing the initiative. The groups, some of the most instrumental groups in writing this initiative were low-income communities and communities of color, and groups that represent working folks like labor unions, because a lot of climate policy in the past hasn't really taken into consideration raising costs on families. And so we really wanted to create a policy that was equitable and just and did take that into consideration. So I always think it's a little bit ironic when the oil companies are out here being like, oh, this is going to cost so much money for everyday people, because since when do oil companies care about everyday people?
So your talk is entitled Politics in Poland.
Sure.
So getting beyond the initiative, because that's a wonderful example of what can be done, but the broader issue of politics in Poland. How does Earth Care Ministries overcome some of the concerns that congregations may have about politics in Poland?
Great question. Okay, let me answer the question first, and then I'll answer your question. So as to the cost, so I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that this is a fee on the producers of carbon. So there's no direct cost to consumers at all. This is on the oil companies and utilities that are still burning fossil fuels. We do know that there's a realistic possibility that they might choose to pass some of that cost on to consumers, and so we've built a lot of protections into the initiative to lower energy costs by doing things like increasing energy efficiency. And also one of the problems that we have right now is that we're just so dependent on this products that oil companies are giving us. So like I always use the example of I'm from Pullman, and so I drive across the state a lot, and I was buying a car, and I really wanted an electric car, but like I would end up out of battery in Washington, with, just stuck there with no way to recharge my battery, and that was not a great option for me, and so I had to buy a gas-burning car. And so the initiative will do things like invest in more of those electric vehicle charging stations around the state so that it's more feasible for us to be using products that aren't so dependent on oil, because like right now, I just learned that oil companies raise the price of gas on average like 50 or 60 cents every summer, just because they know that we're driving more, and they can do that, and we don't really have any choice in it. And so creating ways that we don't have to rely on them so much will lower our costs, because at the end of the day, they're just concerned with charging us as much as they possibly can. So
Could I just bridge the two questions here briefly? When I was talking to your Aunt Balance, who's a Ph.D. professor in economics at the University of Washington, and who was visioning this carbon tax years ago, was doing research in both British Columbia and California on what they were thinking in this area. He started this ball rolling, and there's really been a lot of precedent, a lot of research on it and so on, but it's a very, very complicated issue. Very complicated economic issue. And so, this last legislative session in January, there were 4 different proposals in the same general area, not all of which made the cut, because they were all had different ways of accomplishing a slightly different, but generally the same end purpose. It was really interesting for me to go down as an observer and observe the different lobbying groups, pro and against this. And I was with a contingent of climate action type organizations, including Earth Ministry. And it was most impressive to me to see that whenever the group was introduced as an Earth Ministry or related organization, the doors were open. And this was a very nervous legislature because the day of the opening of the legislative session, a number of Native American tribes had set up their camps on the lawn outside the Capitol, and the legislators were expecting some big raging environmental greening issues to be raised, I'm sure. But when the Earth Ministry and related groups were introduced there, they were able to get into, I, for example, was able to get into the Speaker of the House's office with this group, with expediency and a lot of time allowed, and then to me that was unusual. So I do think we have a lot of precedent in this state. Our Governor Inslee spoke to our group personally, took a great deal of time to encourage us and answer questions, for example. He's running, a campaign pretty much based on climate change as his major topic. And Mayor Greg Nichols started the Mayor's Association on climate change because no one else was filling that void. So I think this really ties into what Reverend Karen was talking about this morning about being a pioneer. We have a number of excellent examples that, of the national leaders who have started here in Seattle. So I do think it's worthy of national attention, this particular campaign. And I would be interested in your, the subject of resistance among congregations in your field work, to initiating any kind of discussion on this topic. And that's one reason that we haven't, as a Earth Care Green Team, really leapt into asking for congregational endorsement on any specific issues, I think.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's kind of 2 sides to the question. There's sort of politics in the pulpit, and then the pulpit and politics. So what can talking about sort of like how do we talk about politics when we're in our worship spaces, but also what can we as people of faith bring to the political sphere?
And can you also talk about what are the resistance?
Yes.
And how are they overcome?
Sure. So I think the most basic and easiest to answer resistance is that a lot of folks think that you are not legally allowed to talk about politics in church. That's a misconception that I think is somewhat spread by people who don't want us to be speaking up about things we care about in church. So the very easy answer to that is that faith communities are 501c3 nonprofits, just like Earth Ministry is, just like Faith Action Network is, just like Sierra Club is. And that means that we can endorse initiatives and we can endorse positions. We just can't endorse candidates. Faith communities are free to talk about the initiatives and the things they care about as much as they want. They can even, your congregation is perfectly allowed to say everyone should vote yes on 1631. You just can't say everyone should vote for, Joe Schmo in the Senate. So that's sort of the most basic, because I know there is concern about the legality of actually endorsing an initiative. So that's sort of the most basic answer. I think that when you get to sort of all of the other reasons that folks are resistant to talking about politics, there's a lot of different reasons, and I think it requires some digging and really thinking through, as a congregation, what the resistance is. So, I think that there are some folks who really feel like as people of faith, it's not our job to be talking about politics, which I have a hard time really sitting through and having that conversation, because to me, when I read, texts, when I read about Jesus, Jesus was a political activist. Jesus was, turning over the tables and talking to not his elected officials, but the officials of his day, and really, speaking up on behalf of people who were not being treated justly. And in the way that our society works right now, when folks are not being treated justly, a lot of times the way that the option that we have to address that is through the political sphere. And so if we want to be agents of justice and agents of change, that sometimes means getting involved in politics, even if it's not the most comfortable thing. I think there's also a concern sometimes about sort of consensus and whether or not everybody in the congregation is on the same page. And I think that sort of with all of those issues, really getting back to thinking about the moral reasons that we're doing what we're doing is really the way to start addressing that. So, like, I'm not working at Earth Ministry, I'm not working on 1631, because I just love yelling at my state legislatures and like really getting in there and fighting. I'm doing this because as a Christian, I know that I have an obligation to care for, the earth, this gift that we've been given. I know that I'm called to create a world where everybody is treated justly and equitably, and right now that's not happening because of climate change. I have these values that are really important to me, and I've looked at it and said, the thing that I can do is to work on passing this initiative, which will create a more just world for people and a cleaner world. And so I think as congregations, going back and looking at those basic moral values that we share, and then sort of how those relate back to these sort of political issues is really the place to go. Because like with Earth Ministry, I love our origin story because Earth Ministry didn't really set out to be a political change agent. But our board and our staff really looked at what was happening in the world and what our values were, and realized that if we wanted to really live out those values, we were going to have to get involved in politics. So yeah, I think that it's a tricky thing, and it's a conversation that every congregation has to have within itself, because the reasons for that resistance are different. And I also think that sharing our stories and our morals about why it's important to us that we get involved in these issues is really the way to sort of move forward from that. Yeah?
You made a distinction between a tax and a fee. It was kind of interesting. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So in the state of Washington, the money raised from a tax goes towards the general fund, and that can be used however the state legislature.
Is that just in Washington? Or is
I don't know what the laws are everywhere else. I'm only a tiny bit an expert in Washington law. But so for the case of Washington, I know that, and so 732, which was a previous iteration of a carbon tax, was a tax where the money went to the general fund. With this initiative in Washington state, the law is that if it's a fee, the money has to go towards a designated sort of purpose. So like if you pay a fishing license, that's a fee, and the money from that license has to go towards, restocking the lakes and keeping them clean and paying park rangers. It can't just go towards education. And so this fee specifically, the money has to go towards investing in clean air and clean energy, and then also kind of cleaning up and mitigating the effects of pollution and climate change that we've already seen.
Yeah, I think that part of the story may not have been told as well as it could have been. This state has had a policy of creation of green jobs for the last 2 or 3 administrations, but when I personally asked them what is the plan,
Right.
it has been tabled and tabled and
Yes.
tabled. So it's time now to have the revenue to
Exactly.
hire the folks to develop,
Right.
fine tune the plan. And I just went to visit the wind farm in Ellsworth, for example.
great.
It's quite a good example of
Yeah.
clean energy production, and your story is very encouraging about Centralia.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it can be done,
It can be.
it
Yeah.
will be if this passes.
Yeah, and I think that a pastor told me this, and I can't remember who, and it drives me crazy, but they were saying, we live in a really scary time, but we also live in a really sacred time, because things are really bad, and I'm very concerned for my future, as a person who's looking at living on this earth for another 70 years, hopefully. And but because of how bad this time is, it's also kind of pushing us all to do things that we didn't really think that we were capable of doing. And so, you know, that means working with groups that we didn't really think that we would necessarily work with. I think that 1631 is a great example of all of these groups coming together who, you know, like faith groups and environmental groups and doctors and all of these different groups who didn't necessarily ever think we were gonna all get on the same page, and labor groups especially. And we've really recognized how big this threat is and how much we really need to do something. And we've all been kind of willing to extend ourselves a little bit into our, you know, out of our comfort zone and do something a little bit different to really make that change. And I think that, yeah, feeling like we actually have to do something about these policies that we sort of have but haven't really done anything about is part of that movement too. Yeah.
Glad you mentioned labor a little bit. You mentioned the last iteration, and one of the reasons that labor went ahead and opposed it was it did not go ahead and include equitable transition funding, whereas 1631, because of involvement by labor early on, it does include what's referred to as equitable transition for people whose jobs are displaced by the reduction in our oil consumption. Will be a focus for how they can go ahead and get good paying jobs, particularly in clean industry or wherever else they would choose to.
Yeah, labor has been, you know, one of our really incredible partners, and that was pretty clear to us, I think, and to the group that wrote the initiative when we started working on this 3 years ago, that we weren't going to be able to create a policy that was just and fair to everyone unless labor was at the table from the beginning. And that was, I would say, having, you know, labor, tribal groups, communities of color, and these sort of traditional environmental groups all at a table together was not always the most comfortable thing at first. And there was a lot of creative discussion that had to happen, but I think that we have created a policy that a lot of, you know, 60% of labor unions in Washington State have endorsed it because they know that it will provide that funding for just transition and for supporting those workers, which is super important. Yeah.
So the coalition is all kind of left-leaning. I mean, roughly speaking, you have to say that it's
Sure.
not throwing many bones to the other side. And I just wonder about, well, you know, just in terms of passing it without doing that. Well, we'll find out in a couple of days, but, you know, it's just, it just feels to me more like we gotta make some kind of peace with those folks, and we gotta, you know, work with them. And 1732, didn't it have something coming back to the industries that actually reduced their use of fossil fuels?
So 732 was more of a straightforward carbon tax, so the money that was put on carbon was just put into the general fund, and then there was also a reduction in sales tax to sort of match that. So it was revenue neutral, basically, which means it didn't raise any money. And I think that in terms of thinking through our coalition and who's part of that, and you know, that's a really good question, and it's a question that we talk a lot about. And I think that in the faith community, it's a question that we talk a lot about because we know that a lot of our fellow people of faith are more right-leaning than we are, or than I am. And I think that for a lot of the groups, it really, you know, I think first of all, a lot of the groups that are part of this coalition now, I would not say are traditionally super left-leaning. So people like the American Lung Association, the Washington State Labor Council, you know, we had quite a few Catholic churches endorse the initiative. So there are definitely, I think that there are groups that would be more in the center that have endorsed this, and I think that oil companies have done a really good job of framing climate change and pollution as this sort of like hippie left issue. And part of this what this coalition has done is recognize that it's not a political issue in that way, it's a moral issue. And for doctors, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, if you're a doctor watching people have increased instances of lung cancer and increased childhood asthma, there's a feeling that you need to act on that. And, I think our approaches to acting on that are different, but, yeah, I don't know. I kind of hope that we can, while obviously it tends to be more progressive people that are endorsing the initiative, I also think that, looking at the ways that this kind of transcends political divisions like that is important.
Well, I'm delighted that you came and talked with us today. I don't know if, are there any other burning questions, or would we, prefer to answer those over the, food for thought, which is the refreshments that I brought out in the foyer? Yeah.
I also brought you all copies of the latest Earth Letter, which is Earth Ministry's publication, if you already have it. Which this month's issue is all about civic engagement in faith communities, so I thought it would be applicable. It's not, there's a little bit about 1631, but it's not a 1631 focused issue by all means, so yeah.
I have some past issues also on the table in the back, as well as just a general brochure about Earth Ministry, who it is and what they do and so on, and further information about, signing up for the national newsletter and, or the blogs, the local blogs, so.
Also, I will do one more plug before we go. We know as of the beginning of this week, only 30% of registered Washington voters have voted, which is very low, and we want it to be a lot higher than 30%, and a lot of people vote on Tuesday. So I would challenge all of you to either text or call 5 people in your network and make sure that they voted, and encourage them to also text or call 5 people, because whatever way you're gonna vote, it's